My father built that lake cabin with his own 2 hands the summer before I was born, and my mother never once let us forget it. She'd run her palm along the cedar doorframe every time we arrived, like she was greeting an old friend. When she passed 14 months ago, my son Darius called me 3 days after the funeral. Not to ask how I was holding up. To ask about the cabin. I hadn't been up there in 23 years. Lorraine had gone every single spring, every single fall, without missing once. 2 weeks in May when the dogwoods came in, 10 days in October when the maples went red. She invited me along every year without fail, and every year I had something. A board meeting. A standing poker game with the guys from my old firm. Routine things I told myself mattered. Now I sit alone in our house in Columbus, Ohio, and I understand with brutal clarity that none of those things mattered at all. Darius called at 8:15 on a Thursday morning. He didn't say good morning either. He just said, "Dad, we need to have a real conversation about the Kellerman property." That's what he called it. The Kellerman property. Like it was a line item on a balance sheet, rather than the place where his grandfather had driven a single nail into raw wood 71 years ago. I told him I needed more time. He said I'd had 14 months. My daughter-in-law Simone was on the line too, though she hadn't announced herself. She does that sometimes. I've learned to assume she's always listening. She has a voice that sounds warm until you realize it's carrying an invoice. "The property taxes alone on a lakefront parcel in that county are brutal, Frank," she said. "You're paying for a place you never use. That doesn't make any financial sense." Frank. She calls me Frank even though I've asked her twice to call me Dad. My son Cody hadn't said much yet on that call, but he was there too, his breath audible on the line from Phoenix where he'd moved 4 years ago for a sales position. Cody is the younger one, the softer one. He said quietly, "Pop, nobody's trying to rush you. We just want what's best for you." I believed Cody. I'm not sure I believed anyone else. The cabin sat on a private lake in Hocking County, 90 minutes south of Columbus. At the end of a gravel road my father had graded himself with a borrowed machine. It was small. 2 bedrooms, a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace that ate through half a cord of wood on a cold weekend. The wraparound porch faced west over the water, and on a clear evening, in October, the reflection of the trees on that lake looked like a painting someone had commissioned just for us. Lorraine had said that to me once. She'd come home from one of her October trips, still glowing with it, and she'd said, "Frank, it looked like someone had commissioned a painting just for us." She'd wanted me to see it with my own eyes. I'd nodded and gone back to the newspaper. Darius called again 2 weeks later. Then Simone sent an email with 3 bullet points about estate tax implications and the strong seller's market for recreational properties in southeastern Ohio. Then Cody called and didn't mention the cabin at all, just talked about the grandkids and hung up too quickly, which is how I knew he'd been told to soften me up and couldn't bring himself to do it. I told Darius I'd think about it. He said, "Dad, you've been saying that for over a year. The property is sitting there deteriorating. You haven't even been up there to check on it." That landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Because he was right. I hadn't been up there. Lorraine had died in January in the hospital room on the 4th floor of Ohio Health Riverside, and I had been so deep inside my own grief that the cabin hadn't entered my mind for months. And when it finally did enter my mind, late one evening in March when I found one of her trip journals in the kitchen drawer, I hadn't been able to open it. I just sat there with it in my hands, feeling its weight until the room went dark. 3 weeks after that conversation, I told Darius I'd go. I said I needed to collect some of her personal items before any broker walked through the door. Darius suggested he and Simone could meet me there. I said no. He pushed back. I said no again, more clearly this time, and something in my voice surprised us both. He told me to check in when I arrived. I drove down on a Saturday morning in November. The drive was longer than I remembered, or maybe I just drove slower. My hands have a slight tremor now that they didn't used to have, a thing the cardiologist calls benign, but that feels like a verdict. I stopped once at a gas station outside Circleville, drank half a coffee I didn't want, watched a crow work at something in the parking lot. By the time I turned onto Lake Road, the sky was the color of old pewter and the trees were bare. I'd forgotten how the leaves come off early down in the Hocking Hills. How by November the woods have a kind of skeletal honesty about them. Nothing to hide behind. The gravel lane to the cabin was grown over at the edges with tall grass that had gone brown. A silver maple had dropped a branch across the drive at some point. I got out and moved it myself, which took longer than it should have. My back told me about it afterward. I didn't expect what I found when the cabin came into view. The porch light was on. In the middle of a November morning, the porch light was on. The woodpile on the east side of the cabin was stacked high and dry, covered with a tarp, tied down with cords. The flagstone path from the drive to the porch had been cleared and re-edged. Someone had replaced 2 boards on the bottom porch step with fresh pressure-treated lumber. I sat in the car for a long moment with the engine off, trying to think logically. Squatters, maybe. We'd had a break-in once in the early 2000s, kids who'd gotten into the locked shed and taken the canoe paddles. But squatters didn't stack firewood. Squatters didn't edge flagstone paths. I got out of the car and walked toward the cabin slowly. Through the front window I could see a lamp lit inside. On the porch railing someone had hung a wreath made of pine boughs and dried berries, the kind of thing you pick up at a rural craft fair. The kind of thing Lorraine would have picked up. I knocked on the door of my own cabin. A woman opened it. She was somewhere in her mid-60s, lean, gray-haired, wearing a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked at me for one long second and then her face did something complicated. "You're Frank," she said. It was not a question. I said I was. I told her this was my property. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, what she was doing inside my cabin. Her name was Bet Colson. She asked me to come in. She said there was coffee and that I looked like I needed to sit down. I almost refused out of pure stubbornness, but my legs were deciding things without consulting me, so I stepped inside. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and pine soap. The stone fireplace was lit, a low fire, well tended. The furniture I remembered was still there, Lorraine's quilts on the back of the couch, my father's rifle cabinet in the corner with the lock on it. But there were also signs of an inhabited life. Books on the kitchen table, a pair of rubber boots by the back door, a basket of knitting near the armchair. "How do you know my name?" I asked. Bet Colson set a mug on the table in front of me, sat down across from me, folded her hands and said, "Lorraine talked about you constantly. Now I need to stop here for just a moment. Because if you have ever had someone say your late wife's name in a context you weren't prepared for, in a place you weren't prepared to be, you know what happened to my chest in that instant. It was like a room you'd sealed off very carefully just blew its doors open." Bet Colson, I would learn over the next 2 hours, had been a retired oncology nurse. She'd moved to Hocking County 6 years earlier after her own husband's death, renting a small house down the road. She'd met Lorraine in the spring of her first year here. Lorraine had been walking the county road and had simply stopped to admire Bet's garden. They'd stood there at the fence for 2 hours talking before they realized they'd never introduced themselves. "She came up here every spring and fall for years," Bet said. "I'd look for her car on the lane. She used to bring me seed packets from that nursery near your house in Columbus. The one on Henderson Road." I knew the nursery. Lorraine had stopped there 4 or 5 times a year. I'd assumed it was for our garden at home. "She talked about you a great deal," Bet said carefully. "She loved you very much. I want you to understand that's not in question." The qualifier made something tighten in my stomach. "But," I said. Bet looked out the window at the lake, which had gone still and gray beneath the overcast sky. "She came up here because she needed to be somewhere she could be honest," she said. "She said at home she was always managing everyone's feelings. Yours, your son's, the grandchildren's. She said up here she could just be Lorraine." That hit me somewhere I wasn't expecting to be hit, because I'd heard something like it before. Not in those words, but close enough that I recognized the shape of it. I'd heard Lorraine say once, years ago, that she felt invisible in her own house, and I'd thought she was tired or frustrated, and I'd nodded and changed the subject, and she'd never said it again. I'd told myself she'd moved on. I understand now that she'd just gone quiet. "Is there something else?" I asked. Bet looked at me steadily, the way a person looks at you when they're deciding something. "She was sick, Frank," she said. "She'd been sick for 3 years before she died." I'll tell you what happened to me when I heard those words, because I think if you've ever received news that retroactively rewrote everything you thought you'd lived through, you know the specific feeling I'm trying to describe. It's not quite disbelief. It's more like the floor of a room you've stood in for decades suddenly being a different material than you thought. Still solid, but not what you knew. Lorraine had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the fall 3 years before she died. She'd had surgery at Ohio State's James Cancer Hospital. She'd had 2 rounds of chemotherapy, the second at a treatment center in Chillicothe, 40 minutes from the cabin. She'd come up here during her treatment cycles. She'd stayed in this cabin and driven herself to her appointments and come home to bed as cooking in the evenings. And she had not told me. She had not told me. "She drove herself to chemo," I said. I heard how flat my voice sounded. "The first 2 rounds," Bet said. "After that she let me drive her. She'd get too fatigued." She paused. "I used to sit with her in the infusion bay. She'd knit. She'd gotten very good by then." I looked at the basket of knitting by the armchair. Lorraine's needles. I recognized them. Bamboo with green caps. I'd given them to her for Christmas the year before she got sick, and I thought they were still in a drawer somewhere at home. "Why didn't she tell me?" I asked. I wasn't really asking Bet, but she answered anyway. "She said you'd been so miserable in the years after the firm dissolved," Bet said gently. "She said you'd finally found some peace." Golf with your old partners. Time for yourself. She said you'd earned it. She looked down at her coffee. She also said you would take it from yourself the moment you knew she was suffering. She said you'd stop living to take care of her, and she couldn't watch you do that. I sat with that for a while. Outside, a great blue heron landed on the dock and stood there in the gray November light, motionless, looking at nothing in particular. Lorraine had loved herons. She said they were the monks of the bird world. She stayed here, I said slowly, working it out. During the treatments, that's why the fall trips. That's why the spring trips. The spring trips were usually follow-up scans, Bet confirmed. The fall was the hard part. The second chemo was brutal. She lost her hair for a while. She didn't want you to see that. She didn't want me to see that. I had been 40 minutes away, playing golf with my retired partners at Muirfield Village, while my wife sat in a chemo bay in Schillicoth losing her hair and trying to protect me from the sight of it. Now, let me just say something here to whoever is listening, because I know some of you are going to feel what I felt in this moment, which is a specific species of shame that comes from understanding you were loved more carefully than you deserved. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm just saying, if the person beside you has gone quiet about something, that silence might not mean they've moved on. It might mean they love you too much to burden you with the truth of what they're carrying. There was more. I could feel there was more in the way Bet was holding herself. She left something here, Bet said. She asked me to give it to you if you ever came. I need to stop here and tell you something. When I drove down to the cabin that Saturday, I had it fully organized in my mind that I was coming to say a kind of goodbye. Maybe collect a few of Lorraine's things, take one last look at the water, and start the process of letting go of something I hadn't properly held on to in 23 years. I was prepared for grief. I was not prepared for what Bet set on the kitchen table in front of me. It was a cardboard box, the size of a shoebox, sealed with painter's tape. My name was written on top in Lorraine's handwriting. The ink was slightly unsteady in the way her writing had gotten in the last year when her hands bothered her. I'd thought it was arthritis. I hadn't asked. I opened it. Inside were letters, several dozen, folded and dated, bundled with rubber bands by year. The earliest were from 7 years ago. The most recent was dated 11 months before she died. There was also a smaller envelope on top, marked simply, "Read this first." My hands were not steady. I opened it. "My dearest Frank, if you're reading this, you've finally come up to the cabin, which means one of two things. Either you're thinking about selling it or something in you needed to come. I hope it was the second one, but I'll take the first one too. It means you're there. That matters. I don't know how to explain the cancer without making you feel like I wronged you, because I did, in a way. I kept something from you that you had a right to know. I've argued with myself about it for 3 years and I never found a satisfying answer. What I can tell you is this. I was so frightened, Frank. Not of dying. I've made my peace with dying more or less over the past few years. I was frightened of watching you suffer. I was frightened of becoming the thing that ended your happiness when you'd finally found it. You were so lost after the firm closed. 3 years of watching you drift. When you finally started to come back to yourself, when you started laughing again, I couldn't be the one who took that from you. So I built a separate place to be sick in. I chose Bet and the cabin and the herons on the dock, and I want you to know it was not because I loved you less. It was because I loved you as completely as I knew how. There are things in this box I never said to your face. Some of them are hard. I'm asking you to read them anyway, because I'm not there to soften them anymore. And you deserve the truth of who I was when I was alone with myself. I love you, Frank. I have loved you since I was 22 years old and you spilled coffee on my shoes outside the student union and tried to apologize by asking me to dinner. I have never once stopped. Forever, Lorraine. I sat in that cabin for a long time without moving. Bet had slipped out to give me privacy. The fire had gone lower. The heron on the dock was gone. The lake had gotten darker under the November clouds. Then I heard a car door outside. Not one, two. I looked out the window and saw Darius's black Audi in the driveway, and behind it Cody's Ford. They'd driven down together from Columbus without telling me. They must have been tracking my location from a family sharing app I'd consented to, during a moment of parental guilt 2 Christmases ago, and then completely forgotten about. Darius was already out of the car, moving fast, his face doing the thing it does when he's trying to look concerned while actually being in charge. Simone was behind him, wearing a coat that was too nice for a November drive to a county cabin. Cody was moving slower, his hands in his pockets, watching the ground. They knocked on the cabin door. Bet had appeared from the kitchen and we exchanged a look. "Should I answer it?" she asked. "No," I said and stood up. I opened the door. Darius's eyes went past me immediately into the cabin cataloging. That's who he's become. A man who catalogs rooms rather than inhabiting them. His eyes landed on Bet and his expression shifted into something I can only describe as prosecutorial. Who is this? He said. Her name is Bet Colson, I said. She's your mother's friend. She's been looking after the cabin for years. Looking after it how? Simone asked, stepping forward. The way you look after something you care about, I said. Darius's jaw tightened. Dad, has this person been living here? Because if there's unauthorized occupancy, we need to talk to her. She hasn't been living here, I said. She lives down the road. She's been maintaining the cabin since your mother got sick, and she was with your mother during her cancer treatments. And I'd appreciate it if you'd lower your voice inside your grandfather's house. The silence after that was a specific kind of silence. The kind where everyone is recalibrating. Cancer treatments, Cody said from behind his brother. His voice was quiet and it had something wrong in it. Pop, what do you mean cancer treatments? Mom died of ovarian cancer. She was only diagnosed. She was diagnosed 3 years before she died, I said. She had surgery. She had 2 rounds of chemotherapy. She did all of it from here, from this cabin, and she didn't tell us. I let that sit for a moment. I didn't know either, Cody, just so we're clear. Cody looked stricken. He's a decent man, my younger son. Whatever Darius became, Cody still has something that can be reached. Darius, on the other hand, had composed himself into the version of his face he uses in negotiations. Dad, I understand this is a lot to process, he said carefully. But that doesn't change the fundamental financial picture. The cabin is still. I know what you're going to say, I told him. Then you know it makes sense too. I know what you've been doing, I said. Both of you. And I mean that. Both, because Cody, you've been calling me once a week with nothing to say, and now I understand that was to keep me soft. To keep me trusting so that Darius could manage the practical side. I looked at my younger son and watched something in his face confirm it. Simone drew up a price estimate. Didn't she? You showed it to Cody and asked him to back your position. He agreed because he didn't want to fight. Cody didn't answer, sir, which was its own answer. Darius said, Dad, we're your family. We're trying to help you. Your mother was my family, I said. She was your family. She came up here alone for years because she felt invisible at home, and not one of us, not me, not either of you, ever thought to ask her why she kept making that drive alone. She got sick, and she decided that what we needed was to be protected from her sickness, because she'd been protecting us from inconvenience for so long she'd forgotten she was allowed to ask for something. I looked at my sons and at Simone, and I felt something clarify in my chest that had been murky for a long time. I'm not selling the cabin, I said. Not now, maybe not ever. But not now, and not under pressure, and not on any timeline except my own. Simone started to say something. I looked at her and she stopped. I'm going to ask you to drive back to Columbus, I said. And I'm going to ask you to give me the next several weeks to read your mother's letters in peace. After that, we can have a conversation. But it will be a real conversation, not a campaign. Darius looked at me for a long moment with the particular expression of a man who is used to having leverage and is discovering he has none. Then he looked away. Cody said, Pop, I'm sorry. He meant it. I could tell he meant it. I know, I said. Drive safe. They left. Bet came out of the kitchen doorway where she'd been discreetly not existing, poured me another cup of coffee without asking if I wanted one, and sat back down across the table. How bad were the letters? She asked. I haven't read them all, I said. She was honest in them, Bet said. I want to prepare you for that. I know, I said. She was always honest when she thought no one was listening. I stayed for 3 days. Bet brought meals. I read Lorraine's letters by the fire in the evenings. Starting from the oldest and working forward, watching my wife's voice change across 8 years of pages. There were things in those letters that hurt. Honest things about our marriage, about the way I'd let distance grow between us and told myself it was comfort when it was really just the easier choice. She was not cruel in the letters. She was clear, which is sometimes harder. But there were also things that held me together while I read. The way she wrote about small moments I'd forgotten we'd shared. A weekend in Put-in-Bay in 1987. The way I'd held her hand when her mother died. The time I'd driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to pick up our grandson from a school trip because his parents were stuck in Atlanta. She'd catalogued kindnesses I'd completely stopped giving myself credit for. The last letter, the one dated 11 months before she died, was the hardest and the most important. She wrote, Frank, I want to tell you that the years I spent up here, whatever else they were, they kept me alive longer than I might have been. The quiet kept me. The lake kept me. Bet kept me. And in a way you didn't know about, you kept me too because I kept writing to you even when I couldn't send the words. You were my audience even when you weren't in the room, you always were. I just needed to find a way to be honest with the you that wasn't right there to get hurt by the honesty. I hope you find something up here. I left the cabin to you in the will, not the boys, because I believe you still have years ahead of you that you haven't decided to live yet. The property taxes are already paid through next year. Bet knows where the spare key to the shed is. The canoe is fine. I had the hull patched last spring. Take your time. Read slowly. And for the love of God, go look at the lake in the morning before the mist burns off. I've been trying to get you to see that for 30 years. I love you, always. Your Lorraine. I went down to the dock the next morning before the mist burned off. I stood there in a coat that wasn't quite warm enough, and I watched the lake surface go from silver to gray to blue as the light changed. It looked like someone had commissioned a painting just for us. I called Cody that afternoon. Not about the cabin, just to talk. He sounded relieved. He talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, and I let him. And it was the best conversation I'd had with my son in years. Darius called twice that week. I didn't pick up. I called him back on Friday and told him the cabin was not for sale and that I'd be spending time there regularly from now on. He asked about the property taxes and I told him they were handled. He asked about maintenance costs and I told him those were my concern. He said, "Dad, I just want you to be taken care of." I said, "I know, Darius. But that's my job, not yours." He didn't have an answer for that, and after a moment he said, "Okay, just that, okay. Maybe it was enough. Maybe it was the beginning of enough." I'm telling you this story tonight because I think a lot of us have someone in our lives who decided to protect us from something we had a right to know. And I think when we find out, we have a choice. We can be angry at the protection, or we can try to understand it as its own kind of love. I've been doing both, some days in the same hour. But mostly what I want to say is this. The people who know us well enough to protect us that thoroughly are rare. If you have one, go look at them. Actually look. Ask them what they're carrying that they haven't told you about. Don't wait until you're driving down a county road alone in November, trying to remember the last time you looked at your wife, like she was someone you hadn't figured out yet. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, what city, what time. It matters to me more than you know. And before you close this out, ask yourself one question. Who in your life is protecting you from something right now? And is there a way to make it safe for them to put it down? I'm going back to the cabin in the spring. I'm going to look for the dogwoods. Lorraine always said the dogwoods down in the Hocking Hills in May were something you couldn't explain to someone who hadn't seen them. I never made the drive to find out. I'm making it now.